Often gamers are mischaracterized as isolated loners. Games are often trivialized today, but when we look at it, they've really been important for serious thinking for hundreds of years. Play is about getting into safe trouble. It's about exploring states that you wouldn't normally get into. Games are a beautiful way of having firsthand experiential evidence of particular domains. There's this strong survival benefit to play. I started writing this book. The inspiration kind of came around COVID lockdowns when, like a lot of people, I turned to games to pass the time. At the same time, I was working at DeepMind, which is the AI company famous for creating computer programs that can best human masters in complex games like Go and StarCraft and so on. So I realized how really captivating games are and was wondering why people find them so interesting and why companies are willing to spend hundreds of millions of dollars creating programs to play games. So I looked into this and realized how deeply embedded games are in human history and how they have continued to shape the way we think and kind of served as a model for ways we conceptualize the world, ways we measure the world in the past several hundred years and kind of infiltrate a lot of our technologies today. I think my kind of entry drug was kind of farming games and just very cozy games like Animal Crossing, which my sisters were playing, and just a way to connect and have a little bit of control over a world when, there wasn't a lot of control in our world at that time, personal control. And then I discovered puzzle games, which I'd loved as a kid, but didn't really play more recently. And it was a really joyful discovery because I think a lot of adults maybe move away from games and then rediscover them at some point and realize that they're just wonderful ways of spending time and a great way to get to know other people as well. It's I think often gamers are mischaracterized as isolated loners, and really it's usually a very social activity. So I had served with the Peace Corps in Turkmenistan when I was younger, and there were children in my village who played a game like a kind of like jacks, where they would roll this bone, like a knuckle bone, and it's maybe kind of served like a die or something. And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's a really, that feels like that must be an old game. That must be around from a long time. And when I looked into the kind of archaeological record about games in Central Asia, there's evidence that it's hard to tell because archaeological evidence of games can be messy, but they find these knuckle bones in the graves of children from 7,000 years ago or something ridiculous. So this is potentially a game that's been played for ages, and there are potential game boards around the Middle East and Africa that look like a game similar to present-day Mancala that are somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 years old. So I was really amazed at the fact that we've been playing games for as long as we have. And of course, it's not just humans that play games, animals play games. And so, even insects play games. So rats can be trained to play hide and seek. There's all this really cool animal work as well. So it's this evolutionarily ancient behavior that humans have continued with. And I think games are often trivialized today, but when we look at it, they've really been important for serious thinking for hundreds of years. And actually, even Plato thought games were important. So it's one of these things where it's trivialized, but also people recognize it's very important. The best answer I have to why people play games, there's a couple. I think it's a form of learning. And it's both a form of learning about the world and how we kind of move in the world, and also a way of learning about the people around us. And one way of looking at this is it's really hard to study play, like for neuroscientists, because you can't really abolish that behavior. It's very difficult to stop animals and people from playing, and it's also for people, you can't stop kids playing. But the closest neuroscientists have come to this is rats will so rats play, obviously, and they have a play vocalization that they make to invite other rats to play. So one rat makes this it's a kind of like rat laughter. It's contagious. All the other rats come and play with the first rat. If a rat is born deaf, it cannot hear the others play vocalization, so they grow up playing much less than their peers. And those rats, as adults, have like a lot of social and cognitive and emotional deficits. So they are aggressive, they are unable to read their peers' social cues, they are less likely to mate. So it seems like there's this like strong survival benefit to play, where it's a way for understanding social relationships. But it's also a way for, like with animals, they will often play with objects in their environment to kind of like understand the physics of things, and they'll wrestle with each other to kind of, play is about like getting into safe trouble. Like it's about exploring states that you wouldn't normally get into, but with like lower stakes than, the real world. Well, one thing that's very charming, I think, is that a lot of people do play like traditional war games. Like some people really get into the history, and there are, of course, like historical reenactments, but there's also people who get really into the history of Kriegsspiel and play that in historically accurate ways, which is pretty amazing because it's also, these games take like weeks to play and they're very involved. H.G. Wells, the writer, used Kriegsspiel, a war game, as inspiration for his own like personal, like a kind of home game called Little Wars. And Little Wars ended up inspiring a bunch of other like D&D and other games, Warhammer. But he created the game because he wanted people to have a firsthand experience of war, in a kind of firsthand experience, because he was a devoted pacifist, and he wanted people to not, it was kind of like the dawn of democracy in that time. It was like in 1911, I think. So he was worried that people were going to maybe vote for wars or weren't going to know how to vote in kind of sensible ways. And so he wanted games to give people a experience of like, just, I think he said something like, anyone who plays this game will see how blundering a thing a great war would be. So I think, unfortunately, his game did not prevent multiple world wars from happening, but I think his intuition is right, because there have been instances where going through the experience of a game has taught us important lessons. So in 1983, the game theorist and economist Thomas Schelling organized a kind of like strategy game for a bunch of American politicians called Proud Profit. So it was, I think they invited like 200 top military officials and American politicians, and they thought through really methodically, like what would a nuclear war look like if we were hit by the Soviets? How would we respond in this event, in this event, in this event? And they took weeks and just like went through all of these possible scenarios, and realized that the rhetoric they had been using, the politicians realized the rhetoric they'd been using was not backed by the technology that we actually had in place, and also that even like the best case scenario that would come out of even a limited nuclear war would still be like basically 1 billion people dead. So this kind of scared the pants off everybody, and the Reagan administration opened up sweeping arms control negotiations with the Soviets as a result, and toned back our nuclear rhetoric a lot. So I think these are examples of, getting to play a game and seeing experientially how it would actually play out. I think it's often depicted in popular media. Like you'll see, um, a war movie where maybe the generals are moving around little troops or army people on the map. But I didn't realize kind of how recent it was. I think often in movies it'll be like an ancient Chinese general was moving things around on a map. And like, first of all, we didn't really have good maps at that time. And yeah, so it's only been in the past couple hundred years that that it kind of came to be. And so I think a lot of my understanding of the game was totally off. And so the fact that it was this intentional invention that took decades of improvements to get to, and yeah, it's hard to say if it's hard to say what war would look like without it. We might have come up with something like it anyway. But it's quite brilliant in many ways. And I think of it as really our first kind of simulation engine. Like pre-computers, officers were able to plan when they would need troop reinforcements, resupply, what the actual, operational level things would look like, because they were using, real data from real battles to predict, if we did this, we're going to lose this many men. If we do this, they're going to lose that many men, et cetera, et cetera. So I suspect something like that would have been invented one way or another. And it's certainly a remarkable game. And I think we're lucky that it was not maybe kept a secret by the Germans, because the fact that so many countries had it somewhat neutralized the fact that it was so successful in the Germans' hands. It's like the perfect way of zooming out on a situation. And, when you think about it, it helped, German generals think about things like, for the longest time, people were using these like strict formations, like, I don't know, I can't think of the official word, but I think it was like maybe Moltke who realized that was kind of a big target, that if you had a strict sort of orderly line formation, that would easily be targeted and scattered. And so they started sending in troops in like loose formations so that there would be less casualties, less of a clean target. So things like this, where it's just very, when you're in the heat of, I've never been in war, but imagine when you're in the battlefield, it's so chaotic, and to be able to kind of zoom out and think about things from that perspective seems like such a huge boon, and I think a really kind of brilliant bit of engineering that people came up with this. In my mind, the biggest downfall of any of these games is you're never going to be able to include all of the complexity of reality in a game. And because the focus will be on a particular aspect of a battle, I think it's common for people to kind of lose the forest for the trees. And so one example of this was, I believe, when the Germans were planning in World War I think when they were planning their attack west, they planned to go through Belgium and didn't really think about the diplomatic repercussions of that, or the civilian reaction. So technically, it was a very sound plan, and it technically played out in many of the ways they expected to, and it ultimately led to what they wanted. But because they hadn't really thought through, okay, Belgium is a neutral country, and it has allies. It's allies with Britain. So if we move our military through Belgium, we are going to draw Britain into the war, and then draw the U.S. into the war, and then we're outnumbered vastly. And then the civilians also took kind of extra military actions against the Germans. So they broke up the railroads so that the Germans couldn't bring in troops and things. And so this hurt themselves, but it also hurt the Germans. And so there was these kind of like extra game, outside of the game, actions that people took that weren't modeled in their technical, planning. And I think that's, in my mind, what games lack, is they're always going to be an abstraction. That's just like the nature of what they are. And so they're always going to lack something. So yeah, I think there's another great example from World War II. Apparently, the U.S. used war games to plan for every possible contingency. I think they more or less knew Pearl Harbor could happen. But what they hadn't planned, what they did not imagine, what they couldn't imagine, was the rise of like kamikaze pilots. In their minds, it just wasn't a possibility. So that was very surprising to them. And so, yeah, I think these games are an incredible way to really exhaustively go through all of these different contingencies. And you can be as thorough as possible, but there's always going to be more creative thinking out there. And I think this also happened in the Vietnam War, where Americans were kind of planning for a traditional war, and the Vietnamese had such different techniques that like no American planning really could hold a match to what like the creativity that the Vietnamese brought to war. I haven't really seen what an AI war gaming engine can do. I imagine it could go off into really weird places. I mean, the thing about AI is it doesn't work the way our minds work, and so it can kind of come up with very creative and weird solutions, and sometimes not really practical solutions. Like, I remember seeing scientists had AI design an antenna, and it like came up with this like bizarre design, which had like one component that was completely not attached to the rest of the components. But if you took that component away, the whole antenna didn't work. So there are all these things that AI creates that we don't fully understand, which I think is partly maybe a pretty decent reason why we shouldn't be using them, because the answers they come up with are kind of inexplicable to us. They're black boxes often. But also I wonder how maybe inhumane their techniques could also be. There's a kind of like, I think there's been a maybe erosion of morals, or like an erosion of I think traditionally in warfare it was like people, like only the soldiers would fight, and I think in the Civil War people were like watching from the hills, like civilians would watch the battle because like they weren't in danger. It was very much like a soldier against soldier kind of thing. And now I think increasingly civilians are almost like held hostage by the potential for nuclear warfare, literally held hostage by enemy forces, so on and so forth. So increasingly, it's like everyone is getting dragged into war, and I worry about whether we had this like erosion of like what constitutes war, and I would worry that AI would maybe worsen that. I mean, I think it's a pretty, I think it's quite a clever solution, because, are we going to like start wars to train people? I think it's a realistic and good way of giving people, simulated experience, but still experience, because this is ultimately what play has always been about. When animals play, we think of it as being practice for adulthood. Kittens will chase balls of string because as adults they're going to have to chase mice or hunt for their food. Animals wrestle, like puppies wrestle. because as adults, they will have to hunt. They will have to fight each other for seniority. These are all ways of practicing in safe realms, because ultimately when like kittens play, they like retract their claws. They don't bite as hard as they could. They're not trying to hurt each other or kill each other. They're just trying to find rehearse the skills and maybe find some like hierarchy, like some position on the hierarchy. And this is also true, I think, for a long time, scientists couldn't figure out what deer antlers were for. And they're like, well, why wouldn't deer just have really sharp horns where they could kill other animals and kill each other if they're like mating rivals? And when they kind of ran simulations of this, it turns out if they could kill each other, then they would all just be dead. Like, that is not a great solution. So they wrestle each other with their horns to determine like who gets to mate with who. And that is like a kind of more polite proxy for, so nature is not as like bloody in tooth and claw as it's maybe made out to be. So I think games are the same thing, or like these kind of training scenarios are the same thing, where it's we're not trying to kill each other here. We're, for now, at least I guess, we're just trying to understand the dynamics of the situation without really putting anyone's lives at risk. I think it is. I think it's a stunning technology. It's beautiful to look at. It's very impressive. It is. I think it's also really interesting that it seems like the skills that make up what a soldier is today are very different from the skills that maybe the military was looking for in the past. Because now it seems like a lot more of the operations can be done remotely via, screen, like by a computer, and like semi-autonomous vehicles and things. One of my worries is that my understanding is, this isn't necessarily a worry, but just maybe a drawback to the technology, is that I don't think the studies I've seen, people who are operating, for example, these drones still get PTSD at more or less the same rate as like soldiers on the ground, maybe like slightly reduced, but not significantly. And so I think some of these things are maybe done to protect our soldiers from the real harms of warfare, which in many ways they are, because people are not on the ground, and but it's still a really troubling and difficult thing to be involved in for people. And I wonder if like VR gets to the point where it's so realistic that people could be really incurring harm or like getting PTSD from just playing games if they're that realistic. And I have seen some games that seem very troubling to me. I mean, this is like a separate thing, but I haven't played like army training games. But anyway, it seems like we can't just rely on that entirely to protect our people from harm, I guess. Often gamers are mischaracterized as isolated loners. Games are often trivialized today, but when we look at it, they've really been important for serious thinking for hundreds of years. Play is about like getting into safe trouble. Like it's about exploring states that you wouldn't normally get into. Games are a beautiful way of having firsthand experiential evidence of particular domains. There's this like strong survival benefit to play.